Yes, thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you, Alvin, and the organizers. After the extreme right, let's switch to progressive ideas and some conspiratorial ideas that are included in the so-called progressive theories. I would like to deal with texts produced by some of those disciplines which pretend to be the ears of critical theory, namely critical whiteness studies and critical race theory. With those texts in which Jews constitute the material or the example of the analyses, but also, and more importantly, the target of criticism, sometimes in a conspiratorial mode. So what is the situation of critical theory today? It seems that it can be characterized on the one hand by growing uncertainty concerning its tasks and normative standards, while on the other by the demand for a more radicalized critique. True, the two phenomena seem to be the two sides of the same coin. What people usually term the crisis of critique is susceptible to promote calls for more radicality as a shorthand solution instead of thoroughly reviewing the basis of critical thinking. More radicality means monocausal explanations, wide-ranging, empirically unverifiable theories, clear-cut and rigid classifications, and possibly conspiratorial thinking. The single most visible symptom of this dialectic of disorientation and enhanced radicalism is the emergence of those disciplines which belong to what some scholars call the New Academy: critical race theory, critical whiteness studies, settler colonial studies, and the like. They should be addressed because at the moment they represent the main critical idiom in the US and have a very large and ever-growing impact on American society, exerting a great and quasi-universal influence on public discussions and on much of public policy. When one examines closer these contemporary critical theories, it seems that the meta-theoretical urge to resolve the foundational crisis of critique is often susceptible to trigger the Jewish question. Can it be the case that critical theories stumble upon issues related to Jews for properly methodological reasons? Undoubtedly, methodology is one source. Clear-cut categories cannot envisage the particular situation of Jewish minorities and the idiosyncratic traits of Jewish assimilation compared to that of other minorities, or the singular features of anti-Semitism. Activist scholarship, in order to arrive at a radical social critique, tries to get rid of those elements which are not easily categorizable, which constitute obstacles for that critique becomes something seemingly stable and unequivocal. An important part of the practice is what Robert Fine and Philip Spencer called methodological dualism, which addresses, I quote, addresses vital distinctions between oppressor and oppressed, power and resistance, executioner and victim, enemy and friend, imperialism and anti-imperialism, etc., but grants them a master status that overrides all other ethical considerations, end of quote. This type of conceptual radicalism, working with entrenched binary oppositions while basing the bulk of its critique on the question of minorities or races in contemporary society, represents one avenue for radical critique to arrive at the Jewish question. This is to say that the search for radicality will, in one way or another, tie their conceptualizations to Jews. And I will give some examples later on. Because their singularity overrides distinctions considered crucial in society, first and foremost based on the notion of whiteness, as it is explained by the theory of systemic racism, one of the guiding principles of critical race theory. One shorthand solution is to label Jews as whites. White, denoting white privilege, white supremacy, etc., has become one of the most important concepts of contemporary criticism. Therefore, labeling people or groups as such is far from being anodyne. On the contrary, assimilating Jews to whiteness, conceived in this manner, reveals a clear political ambition to assert that the fundamental issue is racial, even in contemporary Western societies, and furthermore, that this fundamental racial issue is linked to the color line between whites and blacks, while everything else should be considered negligible. A second solution for preserving radicality is turning to some kind of conspiratorial thinking, which is in fact the easiest way to introduce criticism directed at those who are deemed powerful. Many times the agency attributed to supposedly dominant groups will be interpreted as plotting conspiracies. It has to be noted that conspiracy theories have a very strong connection to the idea of social critique and critical social science as such, which is attested by those debates in which they are talked about in relationship with free speech and the proper functioning of democracy, as opposed to secrecy and the rule of an anti-democratic elite. There are a lot of defenders of conspiracy theories among social scientists and political theorists, and they affirm that those are part and parcel of a democratically functioning public sphere, notwithstanding their possible cognitive shortcomings, epitomizing anti-hegemonic discourse and the mistrust in official and authoritative interpretations, let them be governmental or scientific. This view is diametrically opposed to that of the detractors of conspiracy theories, who emphasize their detrimental impact on the public sphere, public reason, democratic institutions, that is, on democratic political regimes as such. This contrast is often described as a debate between liberals, cherishing open and moderate discussion in the public sphere, and leftists, emphasizing the utmost importance of social critique, which, according to them, tends to be suppressed. Since the work of the philosopher of science Karl Popper, there has been ample discussion about critical social science potentially becoming conspiratorial due to the way they explain social phenomena. Some theoreticians nowadays criticizing Popper even argue that critical social science is by nature conspiratorial and paranoid, as suspicion lies at its essence. This means that the presupposition of conspiracies cannot and need not be avoided. It is to say that Is it to say that there cannot be a clear-cut distinction between conspiracy theories and social critique, neither on epistemological nor other normative grounds? It is not surprising that in the present state of critical theory, certain authors are keen to turn to a conspiratorial type of critique. However, it would be surely problematic to legitimize conspiracy theories by banalizing them as just a form of criticism, and conversely, to denounce all critique as conspiratorial. Conspiratorial thought as a sort of anti-hegemonic attitude becomes especially hard to defend when we consider that conspiracy theories have always been mainly targeted at Jews. It is true that conspiratorial thinking and anti-Semitism are most of the time associated. One of the fundamental aspects of anti-Semitism is conspiratorial thinking, or in the words of Adorno and Horkheimer, the rumor about the Jews. As the great Marxist theoretician Moshe Postone has pointed out, I quote, "The modern anti-Semitic worldview understands the abstract domination of capital, which subjects people to the compulsion of mysterious forces they cannot perceive, as the domination of international Jewry. Anti-Semitism, consequently, can appear to be anti-hegemonic." End of quote. Therefore, if anti-Semitic criticism is reinterpreted as just another anti-hegemonic form of critique, in which the anti-Semitic element is insignificant or even imagined, as it is frequently done in some critical interpretations, then something essential will be missed out. And conversely, if anti-hegemonic critique slips into anti-Semitism as a result of a conspiratorial framework, it is equally or even more problematic. One of the pillars of critical race theory, at gauge of its radicality, is the conception of systemic racism. It works with monocausal assumptions, in the words of Jonathan David Church in his book Reinventing Racism, I quote, "attributing every instance of racial disparity to white privilege, ignoring the possibility that other factors might also provide insight." It is also problematic that it assumes that white privilege is at work in any given social interaction. Regardless of the fact that modern societies apparently have made extraordinary progress in solving a wide range of problems linked to racism, prominent social critics believe that things have not changed or even gotten worse. Therefore, the concept of racism, now systemic racism, and white privilege have grown much larger, even if their instances have grown smaller. Thus, thinking along these lines, racism supposedly never diminishes, even when everyone becomes less racist. This is what some authors, like Coleman Hughes, call the racism treadmill. Every empirically measurable progress with regard to racist behavior and attitudes will be met, the transformed and expanded definition of racism. Therefore, any progress will be conceptually overridden or even cancelled so that the thesis of an eternally racist white society could be preserved. I would like to highlight the conspiratory elements in the explanations that these categorizations and theories invite by turning to some examples. I'm interested in mapping the field of contemporary critical theory and sorting out those instances in which an explanation is turning out to be at least partly conspiratorial and potentially anti-Semitic. I believe that this issue can be divided into two cases. One, when the explanation does not explicitly deal with Jews and critique is susceptible to becoming anti-Semitic unwittingly, or at least to raising the Jewish question by virtue of its presuppositions and methodology stemming from conceptual radicality. An example was described by Susanna Sherry and Daniel A. Farber in a highly important article entitled, "Is the Radical Critique of Merit Anti-Semitic?" from 1995, of which I will say a few words further on. Two, the second case, when besides the methodological elements, Jews are also explicitly designated as dominators in the nowadays fashionable vocabulary whites, as being part and parcel of the white majority, while actively taking part in the oppression of people of color. This is the kind of approach that characterizes most analyses dealing with Jews within critical whiteness studies. For example, the common contention of these disciplines is that white people, or the groups, and among them Jews who became white during the socio-historical process, benefit from the system of oppression of non-whites. Therefore, they have a vested interest in maintaining it while remaining willfully ignorant of the realities of race and racism. In their highly important article, "Is the Radical Critique of Merit Anti-Semitic?" Susanna Sherry and Daniel Farber argue that critical race theory, by its methodological presuppositions, even when it doesn't talk about Jews, necessarily leads to anti-Semitic consequences. If, as some critical race scholars assert, the concept of merit exists only to perpetuate the power of the dominant white majority, what can we make of minorities who were overly successful and even more so than whites, or the group traditionally considered as white? How are the economic and educational accomplishments of Jews or of certain Asian groups can be interpreted? If merit is not at the basis of selection, as the authors, how to account for figures that are so high above the proportion of Jews in the general population? In the author's words, these critiques contend that merit is only a social construct designed to maintain the power of dominant groups, and that merit has no meaning except as a tool for those in power to perpetuate the existing social order. End of quote. For example, according to Richard Delgado, a leading critical race theorist, I quote, "Normative orderings always reflect the views of the powerful and therefore serve to stifle social change. Consequently, the game of normative discussion is rigged against the oppressed, for one cannot use categories like justice, equality, etc. to overturn the very system that created those values." Or, according to Derek Bell, one of the founders of critical race theory, standards are either adapted only to white people or just a sham, a kind of fiction invented in order to prevent black people from acceding to power positions. In the latter case, which race theorists tend to emphasize the most, no social cultural factors can play a role other than discrimination. All differences of achievement are attributed to hidden discrimination, built into standards of merit. These are basically the presuppositions of the theory of systemic racism. Some authors call this interpretation the disparity fallacy. According to Coleman Hughes, I quote, "The disparity fallacy holds that unequal outcomes between two groups must be caused primarily by discrimination, whether overt or systemic," end of quote. Or that the unequal success rates are per se proof of unjust treatment. A very popular writer on race, Ibram Kendi, formulates the same thesis approvingly. I quote, "As an anti-racist, when I see racial disparities, I see racism," end of quote. Which is, of course, amounts to confounding the legacy of racism with actual racism by considering all sociological and historical factors negligible. Therefore, as Sherry and Farber suggest, the radical critique of merit has the wholly unintended consequence of being anti-Semitic. Conceptual radicality of this kind, namely the thesis of eternal racism and white privilege, invites a conspiratorial explanation which will be considered anti-hegemonical. If one of the main beneficiaries of the system seem to be the Jews, then it can be argued that the explanation is indeed potentially anti-Semitic. If merit is wholly irrelevant, the only possible explanation for Jewish success are all linked to a kind of conspiracy, as they had the power to manipulate standards for their own benefit. In contrast to critical racism theory, in sociology proper, or what we are accustomed to call sociology, there has been competing explanations of whether certain social groups perform better because they have more cultural capital in conjunction with higher socioeconomical status or not, or because the standards either for admission or of success are already biased in favor of those who are in a better social position, etc. These are traditional topics, for example, of the sociology of education, which of course has equally furnished innumerable policy recommendations in the past decades. But in either case, the disparities could be amended by compensating disadvantages or by adjusting standards and making them more neutral culturally or socially, which means that in sociological interpretations, usually there was ample theoretical space for social change and political opportunity for reform. However, when critical race theory is becoming dominant in the explanation of inequalities, having the intention of explaining everything by the idea of systemic racism, social change for the better cannot be envisaged. It can be envisaged only for the worse. But in this case, the theory becomes necessarily, at least partially, conspiratorial. This is the case, and this is my second example, when criticism is formulated in terms of unmerited Jewish advantages or Jewish overrepresentation, often turning into accusations of Jews subduing parts or the whole of majority society. In critical race and whiteness studies, the enumeration of supposed privileges of Jews abounds. Their high position in the class structure, the lack of discrimination targeting them, contrary to other visible minorities, the allegedly waning anti-Semitism in the Western world, etc. Like in the classical work of Karen Brodkin, How Jews Became White Folks, and in innumerable other short and longer texts. In fact, the story of Jews becoming white is told twice. First, the structural interpretation. The achievements in social mobility and acculturation gradually attained after the Second World War are not attributed to Jews themselves as actors, but to the social conditions favoring them, while being disadvantageous for others. In the words of Brodkin, it is a myth that Jews pulled out themselves up by their own bootstraps. So seemingly, they have achieved those positions not as Jews, but as whites, not as actors, but as a group favored by structural forces. Jews are diluted in the white group as the particular social historical characteristics of Jews are not considered. This is in fact the type of explanation with which the discourse on Jewish whiteness intends to demonstrate its social scientific credentials by countering individualistic or actor-based interpretations. However, it is clear that the structuralist holist approach in this case directly serves a moral political goal. All that could have been seen as a positive development is in social mobility is downplayed, as Jews have achieved them either as favored by external circumstances or as already being white. But the morality tale does not stop here, as it turns into direct criticism. And this is when the conspiratorial interpretation emerges. For whiteness scholars, Jews' social mobility signals a betrayal of an authentic minority position, along with the aliens with the capitalist system deemed essentially racist, for example, and I quote one whiteness scholar, if not instances of outright racial hostility, much Jewish wealth, even when relatively modest, was generated through catering to captured black markets. End of quote. They also mentioned the wholehearted identification with white America. Another quote, Jews embraced a US identity that made them sentimentally fond of a polity that created unique life chances for them and were therefore disinclined to grapple with historical policies and patterns that made the United States that blacks inhabited very different. End of quote. This critique, by sharpening the critical edge contained in white, goes one step further than the qualification of unmerited social integration and privilege. Now an ethically even more emphatic, condemnable contribution is being highlighted, as Jews, by pursuing their interests, have supposedly been contributing to the solidification of white racial and economic domination, not only by demonstrating that it is in fact possible for a minority to become successful, but also by becoming effectively racist. Another quote, the construction of Jewishness as a model minority is part of a larger American racial discourse, in which whiteness, to understand itself, depends upon an invented and contrasting blackness as its evil twin. End of quote. And at this point, with these citations in mind, it is possible to take note of a more complete conspiratorial explanation than in the previous example, when there was no direct reference to Jews. In fact, the simplest way of reviving critique is introducing some conspiratorial elements in the explanation, which are not implicit anymore. The structural explanation, when Jews are supposed to be favored by structural forces and they are not actors, is completed by an apparently contradictory critical edge. True, there is already a germ of critique in the holist explanation, which points to the ethical critical level. If Jews did not achieve their status due to their individual qualities, but because they were favored by external circumstances, they should not have achieved it at all. However, there is more, as Jews will be blamed for actively seeking white privilege, and at this point, they become actors again, but only as long as they pursue their interests to the detriment of other minority groups. Negatively connoted action is achieved by them as Jews, concerning their identification with the white majority and their purported racism, as conscious traders of their minority position, while, as we saw, positively connoted actions are attributed to structures, their upward social mobility. This means that agency is becoming synonymous with conspiracy. First, because it has to fulfill the normative expectations of the theory, namely to become critical of the supposed group of dominators, within which now the Jews are comprised. That is, anti-hegemonic. But second, agency is taken to be conspiratorial because it is presupposed that only those groups can have agency who are already in a dominant position. A deterministic theory such as structural racism can only be preserved if the exceptions, when there is in fact action, are downplayed as conspiracies, that is, taken as actions outside of the rule or regularities, or attributed to the dominant groups who are already favored by the structure. Conspiracy theories postulate as centralized positions on the basis of the reified notion of interest. Thus, happenings which benefit those occupying dominant positions will be perceived as intentionally and secretly willed by the persons occupying these positions. Conspiracy is the other name of action in a framework where there is supposed to be no action, because the goals of the dominant groups are perceived as being achieved mechanically. Therefore, the conspiratorial framework solves two theoretical difficulties at the same time. On the one hand, it will be possible to maintain the theory of eternal racism, the already mentioned racism treadmill, while on the other hand, critique can be relaunched in a radicalized mode. This leads to the curious result that there will be an overlap between the methodological sense of betrayal and conspiracy and their moral political sense. And so I refer back to what I said at the beginning concerning the progressive defenders of conspiracy theories. However, if interpretation was at least as important as critique, analyzing agency would certainly lead to different conclusions than Jewish conspiracy. Borrowing the concept from the sociologist Marcel Stutzler, I would say that these disciplines, critical race theory, critical whiteness studies, are a travesty of social science. Stutzler emphasizes the strong historical and conceptual relationship between anti-Semitism and social science at its birth, and the struggle between the two for the legitimate interpretation of social phenomena. According to him, at the beginning of European modernity, the Jewish question served as a field on which a lot of highly important topics relative to the emerging modern society were discussed, including its deficiencies and crises. Therefore, modern anti-Semitism is best understood as the travesty of a social theory responding to the same type of society, offering its phantasmagorias of the Jew and Jewification. Similarly, today, critical race theory and critical whiteness studies appear as if they had all the necessary tools to explain social phenomena, but what they develop is nothing more than the potential of conspiratorial explanations already embedded in part of the social scientific tradition, along with the Jewish question, which unwittingly or not emerges in their conceptualizations. Their methodology and form of inquiry are immediately placed in the service of normative conclusions, while their identification of social ills is methodologically botched. Whiteness and race scholars in their evaluations, most of the times tacitly, but sometimes even explicitly, endorse a number of anti-Jewish stances camouflaged as anti-hegemonic positions by seemingly having recourse to some social scientific concepts and tools. Therefore, it is high time to return to genuine sociology in the explanation of domination, hegemony, racism, and inequalities. Thank you.